evening, everyone. I hope you had a chance to grab a quick cup of coffee, tea, and I think people are settling in. Very excited to be at Raisina. I know it's been a power-packed, action-packed couple of days, and we'll dive straight into the topic at hand, solutions from the South. Now, sharp differences between the global North and South have cropped up in the last few years. And every time we speak to experts or economists, one particular topic that they keep bringing up is the term polycrisis. And every year seems like a polycrisis year because the number of problems, seem to be compounding. So before I come to specific questions on solutions from the South, from a security lens, reforms lens, governance and finance lens, I want to get your opening thoughts on, what you think can be, or what solutions the global South could potentially offer. And, is the gulf too wide to even talk about building bridges between the global North and the global South because of the series of crises that we've been grappling with in the last 3 years? Maybe we'll start with Paolo and go around the room.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting, and thanks for this great opportunity to say a few words. Word number 3 of Chaturanga, cooperate. So this is my short message to start this session on North and South together to find solution to the polycrisis.
You're not going to tell us how?
All now? No, you said a short remark to start with. I was short.
Sunjoy? I hope it'll be a little longer than what Paolo's.
Okay. Well, I hope it's not too long. No, you said this is sudden polycrisis being building up in the last 2-3 years. I think the polycrisis has been building up for quite some time. And if you start looking at how this crisis is built up, it all begins with this Cinderella fairy story of globalization. Which was great as it lasted. It was sold to the global South as this great dream whereby they would become integrated markets, you would be selling into the world. And yes, many countries in the South prospered as a result. Then suddenly there are problems to this. The glitzy coach which Cinderella is riding is suddenly decided it's just a pumpkin coach, probably with the end of Lehman Brothers. And you suddenly said, okay, now's the time. In 10 years, you start saying it's about resilience, it's about building, reconfiguring supply chains. Maybe we picked the wrong sister as Cinderella, let's find some new ones. So who is going to be the new sister, who's going to recreate as the new Cinderella going into the future? So there are problems, the narratives which were coming out started being questioned. And this is those questioning of those narratives coming out with the North, which really started reaching this cleavage, and now you have 3 distinct cleavages. You're back to the old world. First of all, you have the Iron Curtain back, the East and West divide. You have a crisis in the Middle East and Gaza, a war being fought by all kinds of means, non-consultative unilateral actions being taken where the global South has not even been consulted. And it is bearing the consequences. The direct consequences, A, of the war in Ukraine, second, of whatever has happened in Gaza, where you are starting to question who stands where in this war.
Right.
Have we lost our moral compass? What are we talking about when we talk about rules-based international order? So all these are questions which the South is asking. And you see these debates being played out now in international forums, whether it's the UNSC, whether it is the International Court of Justice. These questions are being asked, and more countries are rising up and joining the clamor.
Comfort? I think you switched off the mic.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's really great to be here at Raisina. I'd heard a lot about it, so it's fantastic to experience it in oneself. I'll zoom in straight on the solutions. And I'll start by saying that, in a sense, we've always seen and we've always known it to be true that in every crisis are opportunities. And the last 2 years, have been revealing not only for what it's talked about in terms of the tensions and the divisions and the disparities and all the conversations about double standards, but in all that high-stakes geopolitics, we've oftentimes missed some of the good things or important steps that have been taken. One of the most significant developments that happened as a result of Russia's invasion in Ukraine and the decision by one member of the Security Council, not the only member, by the way, but in contemporary times, one member of the Security Council vetoing resolution. A decision was taken by the General Assembly and also by the members of the Security Council to take that issue to the United Nations General Assembly and to have a debate about what happens when a Security Council member uses the veto, i.e. the Liechtenstein formula. I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that that was an important development. Another significant development took place, which was in terms of the players that traditionally come to the table. It was Turkey with the United Nations that came up with a very important Black Sea grain deal to respond to the food insecurity crisis that we saw as part of the fallout from Ukraine. Number three, we've also seen some very creative innovations. After 2 years, or nearly 3 to 4 years of negotiating the AU, Africa Union, UN financing to help African nations lead on peacekeeping. Finally, at the end of last year, the UN Security Council finally passed that resolution. So these are three important initiatives that have developed despite the high-stakes geopolitical tensions that we're seeing, and those are important opportunities and solutions and response to a number of the frustrations that we're seeing by a number of Global South countries as well.
Nada and Dr. Karim, would you like to weigh in that even amidst all the crisis, we are seeing pockets of hope and solutions emerge through some of these initiatives?
Absolutely, and I also want to add that it's not helpful really, or no longer helpful, to see the world in binary terms. For example, when we talk about the Global South, you cannot really lump different types of countries together just so that you can make generalizations. You have countries that are rising like India, countries that are strategic players like the UAE, and then you have countries that are in a state of crisis like Yemen, who are all very different, so you can't lump them together. Exactly. And so what I want to propose is that we start to think about changing the narrative and thinking about reframing the way we look at things. You see a lot of people talking about hypocrisy, right? Like hypocrisy of the West and hypocrisy of also the South in response to Ukraine. But what if we, really try to practice a little bit more empathy and think about that these countries are only trying to be pragmatic in their approach. And here I want to mention an example of COVID-19. When the whole world came to a standstill, a lot of countries in the West, for example, turned inwards. And so we saw countries like India and China rise and come to help
and offer vaccines,
offering vaccines as donations, but not only as donations. Countries that were interested in developing commercial ties and also learning the technology were offered that opportunity. And so that's where the South-South collaboration became more important, and it was a learning moment for the South.
Right. Dr. Karim, how can the South preserve its economic and political interests even as these historical conflicts keep arising between countries in the North and others?
Thank you. Pleasure to be here. I think, have we changed? I don't think human beings are moved by the same kind of things, as we were yesterday. So I think the context is essential. That's the context that had changed for many reasons that we don't understand very well today. And I think there are more opportunities. The system in general, the world is more open. It's interesting for developing countries, the South, if you wish, because it's opportunities, but you have to have solid internal fronts. You have to be organized. It's a more risky world. And of course, it's challenging for the incumbents because, if you're here, you cannot go up. So it's in the brains as well. As human beings, we don't like change. We like status quo. And when you have a monopolistic strategic rant, you don't want to be challenged. So it has to do with psychoanalysis of public policies, ministries of foreign affairs, you've done 30 years of policies in a framework, then you have to change. It's tough. And that's the moment where we are, but we are here together. I mean, Samir told us it's more than 100 nationalities, so we want to understand, we want to connect. So I think this is the natural tendency of human beings. We want to be partners. I mean, there are fights here and there. With your family, you fight. With your neighbor, I mean, it's tough. It's tougher with your neighbor. It's easy for India and Morocco to get along. We don't have much at stake. It's more complex with your neighbors here and for our neighbors too, with our neighbors too. So I think and we have to really understand and to prepare for something different, new institutions. We will speak, I think, about IMF, World Bank, the international financial architecture. We need new security arrangement. And also, those that were not listening a lot have to listen a little bit more. I know it's difficult. There are new kids on the block, sort of, running here and there. It was well organized, 2 camps. So that's more difficult. That's challenges for public policies. It requires more expertise. It requires more work. So that's, I think, the where we are today.
So it's particularly challenging because, okay, A, polycrisis, B, deglobalization, C, fragmentation.
Yeah. I think it's changing. If you don't understand that it is a different word, that your same actions will lead to different consequences because of the context. And that's what we're seeing in Ukraine, in Gaza. The consequences won't be the consequences we used to see in general. That's for sure. There will be different consequences. So my sense is that the crises, they are the same for all of us. Inflation rise, COVID, I mean, we're hit by the same climate is for all of us. So I think this context is well shared, and the solutions are collaborative solutions, cooperative solutions. I will come back to it if you allow me. We are proposing a green bank. There are proposals. It's also a moment where there could be a sort of, something that has to do with romance, that move humans. We're moved by romance and feelings. We're not moved by technocrats and technocratic solutions. If there's the political will, we will do it. Like post-1945, United Nations, great institution, we need those. IMF, World Bank, they're needed. If we didn't have them, we have to invent them. So I think we're in this moment, and we can, and my sense is that I don't want to oppose the South, the North, things like that. So they will be to have, intelligent solutions. We shouldn't leave these to hard power, hard forces. You will need some of it, but I think it's our choice as a human community to do what we want to do out of this. So
right. Paolo, coming to, Western nations and commentators often call out nations from the South as opportunistic. For instance, India's own position when it comes to buying Russian oil during the Ukraine war. Why shouldn't the countries of the developing South look out for their own interests?
Okay, let me start elaborating. I will answer. But let me start elaborating on what Nada and Karim said. They both said that this narrative, North-South, is interesting, but it doesn't help. Actually, I'm quite bored of this, how this debate is shaped and framed with the opportunistic South, meaning that we are idealistic, or double standard of the North, meaning that the South is consistent and coherent, or, as you said in your question, that countries that follow national interest and countries who do not. I think this is, frankly, the wrong way to frame the debate. First of all, it creates ideological walls, because you divide good and bad, which doesn't help to cooperate, word number 3. But second, I think it is intellectual dishonest, because in a previous panel, the foreign minister of Slovakia said, all countries look out for national interest. This is not the issue. It's not if India, you mentioned India, should look out for national interest in buying cheap oil. All countries look for national interest. A better way to frame the issue is distinguishing between countries who look out for short-term national interest and those who look out and look for long-term national interest. And let me give you an example of wrong policy. Europe, I'm not talking about your country, start from my continent, from Europe. Europe looked out for short-term national interest when moved from oil from the Gulf in 1973 to oil and gas, cheap and stable oil and gas from Russia. Or we did not look for the long-term national interest when we moved most of our factory to China. Both turned out to be not in our long-term national interest. And we have been debating de-risking in 55 panels in these days, showing that that was a wrong policy. So going to your question, you asked me, should India look out for its national interest? The answer is yes, of course. But India, as all other countries, should balance the short-term national interest and the long-term. The short-term is cheap oil bought by a country which broke international rule and jailed political opponent. And the long-term national interest is for India to be the champion of democracy, which means the opposite of breaking international rules and jailing oppositors. So that's the question, not if India should pursue or look out for national interest. We all look for national interest.
Sunjoy, I'm going to ask you to respond to that, the short-term versus long-term.
This was not actually a case just of national interest. You see, there's a larger question at stake here. The larger question which India has been raising, and this is not the first time India has raised this, was primarily that, okay, you have multilateral bodies, you take action against a particular member, you do it through a consultative process. You get all the other members on board. Now, in this case, you start taking unilateral actions which are very, very dire. It is not just sanctions. You suddenly one bright day decide that the sort of interbanking system is not going to operate. Now, there are problems. Who suffers the consequences? The poorest of the poor suffer the consequences. And mind you, India's actions, whenever it has been buying oil, actually who have they benefited? Where has that oil been sold? Where have the products gone? Which markets have they reached? Guess where? I'm not even going to say it. So it actually stabilized global oil prices. If India had not taken this action, and I think the kind of instruments used, there's a question, there's a kind of instruments used in these wars. There is no convention which controls these instruments, and the consequences they have are too dire, too far-reaching, and have global consequences. Food shortages, fertilizer shortages, everything follows as a result. So let us be sane about many of these things. Let us not let this outrage carry us away. Let us fight our wars sanely. First, let us not have wars. We do not want the global order to be decided like it was done in 1945 by the victors of any war, whether it is the war in Ukraine or the seas of Gaza. It has to be discussed and decided between civilized people in a civilized manner. And yes, Global South says, we are part of that. We want to be on the table discussing this as to what is going to fall into place. And there are proposals. There are proposals of how the world should be governed. These are being debated. It is not that the world order is static. It's not changing. It is changing. And it has to change. If it does not alter, then it becomes irrelevant. We don't want irrelevant multilateral institutions. Please let us start making them relevant by whatever means possible. They cannot be dysfunctional.
Sunjoy, I have a follow-up question for you. Also on terrorism and intelligence sharing, what more can be done between the global north and the global south? Because there also we've seen double standards emerge, right? I mean, Taliban is good on one day and bad, like good on odd day and bad on even days. So tell us a little about that.
Well, obviously, this problem has always existed. And again, we are getting back into the same kind of debate where we are saying, what is a terrorist? Who is a terrorist? One man's terrorist, another man's freedom fighter. And you keep on changing the definition when it suits you. Sometimes the Taliban becomes good when it finds a particular power, then the Taliban becomes bad. The Islamic State is good when it fights Iran, but when you get into trouble and it actually becomes an entity, then you're going to be using Iran to fight the Islamic State. So see, this definition, this opportunistic definitions which we're using, if we're talking of a global international order and terrorism, let us be very clear about what terror is. What are we combating? The hares can't become hounds and the hounds can't become hares, and you can't race with one and hunt with the other at all times. So you need to, when we start talking of a rules-based international order, then rules, yes, there are universal rules.
But it has to be equitable, and it has to be fair.
No, I don't say there are differences in values. Ultimately, human values are the same. I don't even say there are multiple truths. Actually, there are universal truths also, which we all really agree on, irrespective of which religion, irrespective of which nationality we are. They do exist in the world. The problem is the contexts differ. Now we understand certain contexts, we cancel others, and don't appreciate those contexts. So that is where the problem arises. And that is why you have these multiple narratives and stories which try to control and which really become exercises in how do you increase your power, how do you increase your dominance. Now that is what is wrong.
Right. Which brings me to my next part, and I'm going to ask Comfort and Nara to weigh in on this. How can divisions between the North and South be reconciled? Who should take the lead? And, taking off from what Sunjoy said on making these multilateral institutions, international institutions relevant again, does the Global South also need to make an effort to seek a restructuring and reform of the UN Security Council in terms of, the permanent seats, the veto powers? Are these anachronistic when the top 5 of the global economy leaderboard itself has changed in the last few decades?
Just before answering that, I wanted to go back to something that Karim said, and it ties in with this particular question. The challenge, I think, today is, Karim, is whether the institutions that we have are capable of responding to the polycrisis that you sort of defined. And I think that is the big question. And you saw the way in which the WHO, the World Health Organization, was undermined. So you talk about cooperation at a moment where you saw a sort of a global pandemic. The instinct was not to cooperate, was to undermine the very essence of that organization. This was coming 2 or 3 years after the Ebola crisis in West Africa, where the Security Council, led by the United States, took the decision to call that crisis a threat to international peace and security, which then activated the entire United Nations. Now, again, I talked about at the beginning about in every crisis, you often see an opportunity. The whole issue of the United Nations reform agenda is back on the table again. We've been round the block on the whole question of the United Nations. I think we need to change the narrative about whether should we reform the UN or should we look at certain institutions that we believe are fundamental to addressing the issues that we change. So there's been a lot of focus, Karim, this is going to be something that you ought to address. There have been a lot of conversations about the reform of the IFIs. You saw Miat Motley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, leading that charge, coming out of the climate crisis, coming out of the reform, the debt crisis, saying that we need to find a more equitable way in which to address the financial instruments. Yeah. We need to find a way to ensure that those who sit on the table are those who are facing debt crisis, those who are facing loan crisis, that if you want to have a serious conversation about reforming the international instruments, international financial instruments, even the United Nations, you've got to make sure that those key countries are at the table as well. So if we're serious about reform, we've got to start about representation, about the issues that need to be addressed. And one of the fundamental issues that I think is also at stake is who holds the pen on these issues. So at the Security Council level, yes, we can talk about bringing on more members. The P5, by the way, will all be unified about protecting their own seats. So that's not the issue. But will they be unified? Will there be unity in terms of who else comes into the chamber? I will use the Global South in this instance, because even though I have a problem with that term, the Global South itself, when you look at them from regions to regions, there's even division about who represents who in each region. I'll speak about the African continent. There are 5 regions on the continent. There are 5 major powers in Africa. Which of those countries will be given the legitimacy to sit on the Security Council? So even these countries, even these regions, when you look in Latin America, will Mexico concede to Brazil? You look at Asia, who will Japan concede to India? So it's not as if the so-called Global South is unified
yeah.
on this debate. So I'm all for a conversation on reform, but don't assume that the conversation is tidy on the other side of the house as well.
Nada, and I think Karim wanted to weigh in, so your thoughts.
I think there are various levels, but this shouldn't be discussed on a moral and ethical sort of level. If we want to judge the past, we can, it's history. History is full of blood, and I think we have to be pragmatic. The UN is, by essence, a political institution, and we need to find a new aggiornamento. We're not good at finding and reforming in good times where we're not threatened. So, you take COVID, countries reacted because it's a survival, threat. That's where human beings are good in evolving, even in our personal lives. We're not good if we're not under threat. We relax, and then that's the issue with Europe, for instance. Good life, medical insurance. What do you want to bother? We like it. That's how the brain functions. So, and it's going to be tough, of course, because those that are running those institutions need to feel under threat, and they're not going to do it just because for ethical reasons or moral or high moral. It plays, by the way, also if you have a high moral, and it's part of the leadership, to be just, to be equitable. This is human beings. We hate, injustice. So that's part of the discussion. On the technical institutions like the IMF and the World Bank, we want them to be bigger, we want them to be more efficient, we want them to deliver finance for climate, still continue to finance development, because most of the middle income and low income countries of this world needs funding. They're not at scales. So it's easier than, the UN as an institution. So we have, but this discussion, again, we're having it because there is a context, because the balance of power have changed. Of course, if I'm the winner of the Second World War that will organize the world, we would have behaved the exact same way, Sunjoy, if we were in the same situation, no doubt. So to pass that stage, we need to find efficient solution, to be pragmatic. It's, a fight. We're stronger. And here you can talk about the South. Basically, they're the new kids on the block. They want to be listened, they want to act, they want to be part of the community. How do you channel this energy in positive ways? We have not found the solutions, but these institutions, I think we have to take care of them. If there's a message, you need to nurture, take care of the IMF, of the World Bank, of the UN. They're essential. So don't use them, to affect a third party. Because as Morocco, we need the World Bank, we need the IMF, Africa, we need those institutions. So please do not make them, the place of rivalry, etc. So and we're all observing the behavior of the major shareholders. So if they want to lead, they will need to seduce us. So it's not anymore to have coercive policies. It's about seduction, it's about leadership, it's about, embarking the others. So the whole way of international politics was done has to be reshuffled, and it's tough. Again, we need some psychoanalytics of public policies, it's entrenched in the brain. It's been since 1945. So we are seeing really the change is happening now, not in 1989. It's happening because the context has changed, not us.
Right. We have 15 minutes more, so quickly, Nada, your thoughts, if you'd like to weigh in, and then I'll take closing comments from Paolo and Sunjoy.
Thank you. I'd like to add to what Comfort and Karim mentioned, is that I think we should be able to talk about the importance and value of multilateral institutions while at the same time talking about what can be done to improve them.
In terms of making them more effective.
Exactly. And I think a lot of time, in the news, especially, the negative or the criticisms of multilateral institutions and, the failure of the rule or the selectiveness of the rules-based order is prominent. But I think we should take moments to recognize efforts, successful efforts by these organizations that are not in the news. And I can mention an example from Yemen, which is the efforts of the UN Special Envoy for Yemen, Hans Grundberg. He's been working tirelessly on a peace agenda and continues to work on this very important diplomacy effort. And without it, I think peace might not be possible in Yemen. So we need to make more efforts in highlighting these positive news that these multilateral institutions are delivering.
Right. Paolo?
I teach international organization. And my first class with my student, I go to the student with, in one hand, a small book, the UN chapter. And on the other, 3 books like this, which are a collection on essay on the UN reform in the last 70 years. So to reform 50 page, there is an encyclopedia like this, huge. Why do I say that? I say because I started saying that I'm not excited by how the debate North-South is framed. And I now want to say that I'm worried when I hear that there is a desire to redesign the UN or the international organization system. Because it will not go anywhere, as was said by all my colleagues. The reform of the UN Security Council, aiming at a big picture, a big redesign, is with this conflict situation and the contest we are facing, it's impossible. So we risk debating for years something which will never happen, like the big book and the short chart. As Karim said, and as Nada said, as everyone said, it's more important, it's crucial to work on what unifies us, what is feasible, reform what is reformable now, immediately. Start from technical agency, which are not only the financial institution, but all the UN the UN technical agency, the OMS, for example, you mentioned the WHO. So let's work on that. Let's not be diverted by the dream of a big design, which will never work. As was said, the UN security reform was stuck 25 years ago when Italy managed to put together a group of countries against Germany entering the Security Council. In Latin America, countries opposing Brazil entering the Security Council. And Asia. So we have more powers than region in the world. So finding a solution to that will be impossible. It is sad, but let's not forget, let me talk to our future leader, not to give them a pessimistic view. The UN has been paralyzed for 60 years when it was created, because the Cold War prevented any role of the UN for the first decades. And that's why the UN developed technical agency to work on technical field, as in Europe with Jean Monnet. So we have survived these 60 years. Now we are back to this situation in which the UN Security Council is paralyzed. But let's work and cooperate on many other issues, and there is an arena to do that, North and South together.
Right. Sunjoy, I'm going to give you the last 2 minutes, and then we'll take a couple of questions from the young Raisina fellows.
So carrying it forward from where Paolo left off, I think if the reforms do not happen, we are going to see more of what we see occur around the world, which is primarily that there are other agencies who start getting the clout by getting the membership, getting more members. You've seen how the G20 expanded, has become Africa as part of the
African
G20,
Union is part.
how the BRICS is expanding, and a lot of these smaller plurilateral organizations try to find regional, local, group solutions to the really big problems, because you see, the problems demand collective action, and the problems are too many. And if you think that individual nations can resolve them, they cannot. Climate is one such thing. You have the whole problem of what is to be done with artificial intelligence. How is artificial intelligence going to be governed? How is space going to be governed? These require committed global solutions. So if you do not have an apex body which is going to do it, and you're not going to, my opinion is that the apex body will stay. How functional it is for us to determine. Let us try and make it functional. Otherwise, sub-solutions, suboptimal solutions will be found by groups of countries in their own little clubs.
Yeah, and as she said, different countries have different interests, so it can't be a homogeneous region. We will have different smaller institutions. But I'm going to, I think we have 10 minutes, so perhaps we can take a couple of questions. Can we have a mic there?
You have your Raisina young person standing up already.
Sure, yes.
Hi, thank you very much for this. My name is Robbie Grammer. I'm from the United States. Two quick questions. The first, the United States has always had a close relationship with Israel. That's not new. But I'm wondering if this crisis is different and how it's affected views on the U.S. as a so-called global leader, particularly after the latest UNSC veto. And then also, there's been a big theme this week about needing UNSC reform, part of this, revamping the multilateral system or decolonizing it. But as some of the panelists mentioned, this is a long, tired debate that's just been dragging on for decades with no real endpoint. So do you actually see this as a transformative moment for UNSC reform, or do you think there's just going to be another 10, 15 years of sort of useless negotiations that lead nowhere?
Who wants to take the first one on US-Israel? Comfort, do you want to take it?
Sure, and it's good to get the question from Robbie. I mean, it's a very difficult conversation, because at the start of the conflict, I mean, I think, Robbie, correct me if I'm wrong, I think within 3 days of the horrific attacks by Hamas, President Biden went to Tel Aviv. I mean, a lot of us were like, is this a good thing? What signal are you sending? But he made an important message. He left an important message behind to Israel. Learn from our mistakes of 9/11. Our response was emotive, and some of the steps that we took are still playing out today in the region. And there were ramifications and consequences. But what has evolved since then hasn't been a lessons learned about 9/11. The objectives that Israel, even if it had the right to defend its citizens, the objective, the idea that you can degrade, get rid of Hamas. I mean, I think there were a number of people, even on the US side, who had question marks about that. Robbie, I think the challenge today for the US, even if we acknowledge that the US is the only actor in town that has the leverage and influence that can shape and alter Israel's position, the lesson I think a lot of people are watching is that the US is increasingly losing its currency. It's increasingly losing its credibility in the face of 30,000 or plus civilians dying, women and children in Gaza.
Yeah.
And the fact that the arms and unconditional support to Israel, despite the public frustrations that the US continues to display, I think a number of people will quite rightly hold the US to account alongside with Israel for how the war is resolved. But if you don't mind, on the question on the Security Council reform, look, as important as that is, I don't think that is the formula. Yes, the Security Council is dysfunctional. We know it. We've been here since the last 60 years of the Security Council. However, it was President Biden who put the issue of reform on the agenda as a result of the Zelensky challenge. So back to you, Paolo, it wasn't anybody else, it wasn't the Global South itself that brought the UN reform question back onto the table. It was President Zelensky, because he said that how can you have a chamber that is supposed to be the apex body for international peace and security, how can it have an aggressor in its chamber? And hence he raised the question about reform. Biden went with it. So I think it's the West that owns the debate, not the Global South, even though the Global South clearly would want to see a reform of the chamber.
Sanjoy?
Can I have a quick response?
Quick response, 4
to
minutes.
the bit about the US, just one sentence response. See, the United States is ultimately a democracy. And it is a democracy we all respect. We respect the people of the United States. Ultimately, the United States will do what its people want, and they will want to do it the right way. That is my answer to you, and you are part of it.
Right, one quick thought.
Yeah, I would say we spoke a lot about national interest, but personality matters. So history is done by personalities. So heads of states matters. So it makes a difference. We're acting within a context with given personalities. So what you're observing in Gaza and Palestine is also actions by personalities.
Right.
And they will produce certain effects. Other personalities would have produced something different. On the UN Security Council, I think we're getting obsessed with it a bit too much. Sunjoy mentioned something interesting. By obsessing by the Security Council, we're not innovating. Maybe it's a distributed word. We need 5 or 6 Security Council per regions. I don't know. We need to think a little bit out of the box. You know, different word, distributed. There's not one center anymore, multiple centers. I don't know. We should think.
We have 3 minutes, so I'm going to give you an opportunity, ma'am, to ask a question. Yes.
Hello. Good evening, all. My question is regarding global security, bringing in 2 scholars, Michel Foucault and Carl von Clausewitz. Clausewitz says that war is a continuation of politics by other means, whereas contrarily, Foucault says politics is continuation of war, and war shows us nature of power relations in a way that is concealed in peaceful politics, but still continues to operate beneath the surface. And how do you comment on that, how the policy framework would be in such a context when war is every time? And a short comment to the last person on the panel. You said that we should do what is reformable, do what is possible, do what we can do. But a contrary opinion of me and Professor Randhir Singh, we should do the impossible, because it's by doing the possible that we have reached here. Yeah,
thank you.
Thank you.
Sorry, just 1 minute on the clock. So, Paolo, you want to take the question, or Sanjoy? Okay.
Comment, not a question.
No, I agree with that. The whole idea of humanity is to challenge yourself, and we have been challenging ourselves through the centuries. If ultimately we will find a solution, because if you get to if this kind of a gridlock, that gridlock itself determines that certain structures will not hold. You will have alternatives coming up. The best thing is, the shortcut is, the easier way is to let the institutions evolve organically. I'm sure they can, they will. There's a lot of thought going into it. If they do not, then yes, we are seeing alternatives develop. The world is not going to stop. The good in this world is also not going to stop.
More younger people in public policy positions. They have less interest in the status quo, so we need more younger people in decision-making solutions.
Right. On that note, thank you all very much. And as you said, Karim, maybe we need to think out of the box, a psychoanalysis of the mind to come up with different solutions. But thank you all very much for being a wonderful audience, and big thanks to our speakers as well.
Thank you so much.